Hi, I call this video Argument Interlude, not because we are taking a break from Plato, because this information is certainly applicable to Plato, but it's applicable to all philosophers that we'll be looking at. So I have been holding off on doing this simply because we want to take these things bit by bit. So you might remember that in the analogy of the apology, we talked about two aspects of the philosopher. We distinguished them into intellectual and affective aspects. So the intellectual aspects would be things having to do with your mind, with knowledge, with particularly knowing methods for coming to the truth and certainly coming to the truth. And the affective aspects, those are the character traits that support love for the truth, or in general, whatever our character traits are, because they all support some kind of a love. So one of the points that I believe Socrates is making about the Athenians is their heart was in the wrong place. They didn't love philosophy, they didn't love the truth, they loved money and power and glory. Now, what we're going to talk about is some more of these intellectual habits. So we've already looked at the habit of definition, how to define your terms. And part of coming to the truth would certainly be clarity about what it is you're talking about. This other part has to do with understanding why things are so, and that's my definition of an argument. It's to see why things are the way they are. That's why philosophers provide arguments. They're not trying to necessarily prove their points, but rather think of them as trying to understand their points. The argument gives us the reason why. Okay, and it also gives us an ability then to turn around and to teach what we understand to others, to set it up in kind of a logical order where we start with what's best known, what may be easier, and we move out from that in a step-by-step fashion. If this sounds a little bit like the Socratic dialectic and why Socrates always wants to talk to people, then yes, you're exactly getting it. That's part of what Socrates was getting at. As far as arguments go, there's two skills. So we can describe them as, and this is the way I talk often, analyzing arguments and assessing them. And we'll look at both of these in order. So to understand an argument, we should have some new terminology. So we have to understand something about parts of an argument. So we would talk about the reasons that we give for what we believe. We call them premises. And the thing that we believe, the thing we're trying to prove, maybe in a mathematical proof, is the conclusion. So what are some examples? Well, anytime anytime you are giving a reason for something, you are implicitly giving an argument. So here's something that we saw in the Euthyphro. Socrates says, I dare say, and you shall tell me at some other time when I have leisure. But just at present I would rather hear from you a more precise answer, which you have not as yet given, my friend, to the question, what is piety? When asked, you only replied, doing as you do, charging your father with murder. So you might remember this is the first definition that Euthyphro gave. Euthyphro, and what I said was true, Socrates. No doubt, Euthyphro, but you would admit that there are many other pious acts. Yes, there are. Remember, I did not ask you to give me 2 or 3 examples of piety, but to explain the general idea which makes all pious things to be pious. Do you not recollect that there was one idea which made the impious impious and the pious pious? And the argument and the dialogue goes on. So we can put this in a little more of a structural or a pattern-like fashion to make the argument a little clearer here. And we do this in philosophy sometimes because when we make it more clear, then we can see its steps and we might have a better grasp on what the kind of problems we might have with it. So here's how I would say Socrates is arguing. He's doing something like the general idea which makes all pious things to be pious is one thing. Examples of piety are many things, so examples of piety are not the general idea which makes all pious things pious. So do you see? I hope you can appreciate how that is kind of an orderly sort of thing, starting with something that's kind of basic, our idea of definitions, and then looking at other things, and then making a contrast. Basically, it's arguing that the one is not the same as the many here. Sometimes in Plato, the arguments are a little more compressed and not spread out over discussion. So here's a longer passage near the end of the Apology. Let us reflect in another way, and we shall see that there is great reason to hope that death is good, for one of two things. Either death is a state of nothingness and utter unconsciousness, or as men say, there is a change and a migration of the soul from this world to another. Now, if you suppose that there is no consciousness, but a sleep like sleep of him who is undisturbed, even by the sight of dreams, death will be an unspeakable gain. And then Socrates goes on to explain why he might think, or anybody might think that is so. So I'm just going to skip down a little bit to the second part of this, which happens down near, where is it? Right there. But if death is, but if death is a journey to another place, then there, as men say, all the dead are. What good, my friends, my friends and judges, can be greater than this? Okay, so he's given us two options for what death might be, but both of the options end up being good options. The structure of this argument might be restated something like this. Death is either a state of nothingness and other unconsciousness, or as men say, there is a change and a migration of the soul from this world to another. In other words, death, D, is either A or B. If you suppose that there is no consciousness, but a sleep like the sleep of him who is undisturbed, even by the sight of dreams, death will be an unspeakable gain. For eternity is then only a single night. So that you could characterize that as if A, then Q. If death is the journey to another place, this is the second part of what we call this a conditional. And there, as men say, all the dead are. What good, oh my friends, can be greater than this? So you could think of that as saying if B, the second part of our either or, then Q. So either way, it looks like Q. There is great reason to hope that death is a good. Again, that's the structure of the argument. And of course, whether we agree with it or not has to do with both whether we think the argument is valid, seems to be set up correctly, and this is an example of one that is set up correctly. I don't see the logic has any problem here. And then the second part would be whether we think any of these statements, particularly 1, 2, and 3, are true. One more. Okay, this is sort of getting small, isn't it? But this is a passage from the Gorgias. And here, this is near the end of Socrates' discussion with Gorgias, and Gorgias has already said that if a rhetorician is an unjust person, that's not the teacher's fault, but that person's fault. And here, Socrates says that if he asks him, well, if somebody comes to you and wants to learn rhetoric, either he will be just or will you teach him justice? And Gorgias says yes. And I lied to this a little bit, but if you teach him justice in the same way he who has learned what is just, and he who is just may be supposed to do what is just, and must not the just man always desire to do what is just? Surely then the just man will never consent to do injustice, and according to the argument, the rhetorician must be a just man, yes, and therefore never be willing to do injustice. You could restructure this argument this way. Every rhetorician knows the nature of the just and the unjust. Everyone who knows the nature of the just and the unjust is just. Everyone who is just does what is just and desires to do what is just. Therefore, so kind of see how this argument is taking us to this conclusion. There's a couple conclusions here, actually. The just man will never do or will never consent to do injustice. Every rhetorician will never be willing to do injustice, and therefore a rhetorician cannot make bad use of his rhetoric. So this is the contradiction that Socrates caught Gorgias in that argument. Okay, so there's a couple examples of moving, and you know, you're going to get better at this as you work at it, from seeing these things in context to trying to understand, and this kind of really, and I really think that, you know, putting things into numbers and listing them out and then trying to follow the steps really helps us in examining these arguments and trying to be clear about how they work and then whether we think that they work. Which takes us to our second issue, the conditions for a good philosophical argument. And I see my time right there, so I'm going to stop this right here and put this into a second video to give you another run at it.